Good morning. I am your host, Cindy Welch from the Southwest Florida Library Network. Thank you for joining us for Introduction to Library Cataloging Standards. Our presenter today is Dr. Karen Snow. Dr. Snow is an Associate Professor and Ph.D. Program Director in the School of Information Studies at Dominican University in River Forest, Illinois. She previously worked as a cataloger in the Rare Book Room, University Archives, and the Technical Services Departments at the University of North Texas. She currently teaches beginning and advanced cataloging courses at Dominican University, both face-to-face and online. Dr. Snow, thank you for being here. Over to
you. Thank you so much, Cindy. Really looking forward to spending my time with you all this morning and hopefully learning something new with you all. So first off, I want to say that I forgot that SWFLN uses Adobe Connect, and Adobe Connect always seems to mess with my PowerPoint slides. So if the formatting is a little off, more off than usual, it's because of that. So if things kind of start getting all wonky, that's why. So I apologize ahead of time for that. So okay, so this webinar, we will have some time at the end for questions, but I do encourage you to post questions or comments in the chat area if you do have anything that you want to talk about as we're going along. I like that interaction. As long as it doesn't get us too far off track of what we're talking about, that's fine. But there should be a little bit of time at the end of the presentation for any questions that you have. This webinar also is designed for those who have little to no cataloging experience. I recognize some names in here as people who have a lot of cataloging experience, which is great. It's really great to see you all. But some of this stuff may seem really basic to you, but it might be a good refresher for you regardless. But like I said, I'm trying to conduct this webinar in a way that those who don't have that cataloging experience can also understand what's going on. So kind of keep that in mind. So wonderful. So first of all, that's me. So for those who have not seen me in person, because I've given workshops and webinars for SWFLN for years now. But in case you don't know me, this is me. As Cindy said, I teach cataloging at Dominican University, which is just right outside of Chicago in Illinois, full time. Now I'm teaching completely online. I was teaching some in person, but now I'm teaching completely online for the foreseeable future. And that's fine. I am completely comfortable with that. I've been teaching online for almost 15 years now. So I'm totally fine with it. So, all right. So good morning, everybody. Let's go ahead and get started. And here's my email address as well, in case you want to email me about anything else. So, all right. So learning outcomes. Okay. Let's just start with what we're going to cover today, so you know what basically we're going to talk about. So the learning outcomes. So by the end of this webinar, you should be able to identify cataloging standards commonly used in libraries. Okay, so not in-depth knowledge or anything like that. I want you to at least be able to say these are kind of the main ones that are used in libraries, and understand the purpose of each standard. Right. So it's one thing to know that MARC is machine-readable cataloging, but what's the point of it, right? So I want you to understand, why we need MARC, how we use MARC, etc. And then recognize how cataloging standards work together to form a catalog record. When we catalog, it's not just with one standard. We use multiple standards to construct one catalog record. They work in tandem, and it's important to know not only what they are, but how they kind of work together to kind of form a catalog record. And then finally, describe how the cataloging decisions impact library user experience. We're not doing this in a vacuum. When we do catalog, when we create a catalog record, we need to understand how our decisions impact what the user sees and is able to do in the catalog. So, so that's the basics of what we're going to talk about today. This is the first of at least two webinars. It's just kind of laying a foundation for cataloging knowledge that we'll just kind of build from there. What you're learning, so we get kind of slightly more advanced over time. But this one kind of lays this foundation. Okay. So, all right. So, library catalogs. that's the focus of the next hour. Is library catalog. How is it constructed? How is it maintained? And nowadays we primarily use like online catalogs, right? So the OPAC for short, the Online Public Access Catalog. But that's not always been the case. So prior to the 20th century, the book catalog, which you see in the upper left-hand corner, it was the common form of catalog, which was essentially just an inventory list. But over time in the 20th century, the card catalog dominated. And I'm sure some of you all have experience with that. You may have actually cataloged for a card catalog or used one. I know that I did. But it just, even though it was a wonderful invention and tool, the OPAC, the online catalog, allows us to do a bit more, right? It has greater functionality in terms of allowing patrons to search and browse our collection, so way beyond just the inventory aspect. So let's talk about what a cataloger does. I mean, a cataloger does many things, as we all know, but like at the basic level, what does a cataloger do? Okay, so once again, at the basic level, what a cataloger does is take whatever resources, so recorded information, resources that the library collects, and tries to describe those resources in a way where users can find them. Okay? Once again, the very basic level, that's what catalogers do. Whatever those resources are, whether it's books or music or DVDs or artwork or documents, obviously it depends on the library or the archive or the museum, but the collections will differ, and we have to decide how best to describe those collections so they can be found, because that's really key in cataloging work, is that ultimately what we're doing, it's for our users, whoever they may be. We're serving them, and we need to describe it in a way that they can understand and that they can find things, right? So that's our goal. Now, for smaller collections, the way we describe and organize those resources may differ, right? So if it's a small collection, we don't really need any sort of elaborate organizational scheme like at home, right? I'm sure you guys know this, like in maybe your home collections, you just kind of, if you do have like books or DVDs, etc., you just kind of organize them in a way that makes sense to you or your family, right? So probably maybe you do throw all your books on the floor and keep them in piles like this, but maybe you just kind of keep them in a somewhat random order on the shelf. And once again, it's for your personal collection. That's fine. There's nothing inherently wrong with that. However, in a library that serves more than just you and your family, we need to have a way to describe the resources and organize them in a way that many people will be able to find and utilize those resources, right? So, so that's really kind of once again the foundation of the use of library cataloging standards is this understanding that we need to be able to organize our collections in a way so that people can find things more effectively and efficiently. Okay, so that's why they're so important, and that's why catalogers really like their cataloging standards, because it really helps them do just that. Okay, so that everyone can do their jobs better, right? So what we do as catalogers is we create what's called metadata. Okay? This is a term that's kind of more recently been fashionable, but it's a word that really encapsulates what we've been doing for many hundreds of years in the library world, which is to essentially, it's information that's about other information. So essentially a way of describing resources that we have in our collection. So data about data, in It's quite literally data about data is metadata. And metadata, it's all around us, whether we realize it or not. So in the top, the left-hand, sorry, directions, left-hand corner of my PowerPoint slide, I have what's called a MARC record. I mentioned machine-readable cataloging before, and we'll talk more about that in a moment. But that, what you're looking at here is metadata. Okay, so this represents a book called The Organization of Information by Arlene Shaler and Daniel Jadre, and it's not the book itself, right? This is not the book. This is information about the book. What we find in our catalogs is primarily metadata, right? So information about information. But we see this beyond the library catalog as well all the time. We have to utilize and create metadata for us to stay sane, essentially for the world to make sense. So if you use like iTunes or any sort of music organization program, once again, there's metadata right there. In order to find your songs, there really needs to be a title and an artist, probably at minimum, or else it's going to be really time consuming to kind of go through each and every song to figure out which one is which. Right? So title, artist, album, genre, right? So like rock and so forth. This is all metadata. And same thing if you go to the grocery store, you need to have labels on the packaging, like so you can tell what it is that you're looking at. So bread or cereal and the brand and so on and so forth, and nutritional information. This is all metadata, information that allows you to better understand what it is, okay, whatever that resource or item is. Okay, so all around us, all around us is metadata. And so that's primarily what we work with, is metadata in describing resources. And I thought it would be best to kind of define what I mean by resource, because like I said before, what a resource is kind of depends on where you work and where you go. But according to this definition, it's any object or collection of objects that is of interest to you or your users, and that can be described in some way. Okay, so that can really be anything from books to posters, artifacts of any sort, so like photographs or documents, puppets, towels and snowflakes, right? There is actually a snowflake classification system and so forth. So really anything that like a library, an archive, a museum, etc. would collect. Okay, so that really can be many things. And some of you all, you work at a library that collects these like library of things. Have you guys heard of this, the library of things movement? That's especially like the last couple of years, it's been much more popular, where especially public libraries, but really any library collects these objects like fishing poles or bikes or umbrellas or sewing machines or hotspots that are artifacts that people can kind of they'll circulate, right? People can check them out and try them out if they only need them once, right? Or they just want to try out that the sewing machine once, etc. The bubble. So and we need to be able to describe those things, just like we do for books and DVDs. It's we want metadata for these things as well, and what libraries collect really will depend on their user population, their community, what they're interested in. So the resources, in other words, what I'm saying, that are collected will depend on the community, and that's fine, right? There's nothing wrong with it. So, okay. So whatever that is, right? So whatever that resource is that the library, archive, museum collects, we want to take that resource and kind of put it through the motions here in creating a surrogate. Okay, so we take whatever it is, then the person creating the metadata will look at that and then describe it in a way, hopefully, that their users can understand. And usually there's some basics here, like author, title, subject. Okay, these are categories that have been around for a very long time in the library world, but oftentimes we need to go beyond that. Yeah, so we want to include further information to describe the resource in a way that people find it, right? To identify it and find it, and so forth. So we create these surrogates. So the metadata that you're looking at, the catalog records, are a surrogate for that resource. It's not the resource itself, it's the surrogate. And there's different standards that we use to do that, right? I mean, we could, like, I can just pick up a book and say, okay, that's the title, and I'm going to write it this way, and this is the author, I'm going to write it this way, etc. I mean, that's totally fine. But once again, going back to what I was saying before about, trying to be standardized, trying to be consistent so that people can find things in the library, the use of standards are really critical for that. So most catalogers, what they do is they take these commonly used standards and then use those to describe the information resources. So here I just have Dublin Core. I don't know if you guys have heard of Dublin Core before, but it's an element set that's used around the world. Very basic. It's just a list of element names. So you can see here down the right-hand side of my slide, it has 15 elements in it, from like contributor and coverage, creator, date, etc., that you can use to essentially kind of categorize information or metadata about a resource. So I have this example of like this photograph of a dog at sunset, where I use, the element, which is kind of the category description, and then what's called the value in a table here, so which will differ, right? The value will differ depending on the resource, right? So like the date will change depending on, the photograph, when it was taken, and also if it's a book, et cetera, et cetera. So Dublin Core is actually a very basic standard. It's one that we typically use in like digital libraries. You don't really see it quite as often in kind of like the traditional library catalog, but you may see it in other places, like in digital libraries. So, and there's many different standards. Okay, so and these are just a few. These are just some examples of different standards that we use in the metadata world that include like just kind of more traditional library cataloging, and also goes beyond that to other communities that use metadata for different purposes. So I like this kind of graphic just because it helps you kind of separate out the different types of metadata that you may encounter. And I think it's important to keep this in your mind, that there are many different standards of metadata, first of all. Okay, so first of all, there's many different metadata standards. And second of all, they serve different purposes, essentially. Okay, so as you can see here, like just as an example, in the upper left-hand corner where it says metadata structure standards, those are just schemes or element sets, like I mentioned Dublin Core. That's listed there, Dublin Core elements, and those are just, like I said, usually just a list of element names and their definitions. It's just at the very basic level. You can see here there's other standards like mods and VRA Core. MARC is technically an element set as well as an encoding standard. You can see here in the bottom left-hand corner. Rda, which we'll also talk about, provides elements. But you can see here that Rda is not an encoding standard. Okay, so an encoding standard is what we would use to encode, right? To make our metadata machine readable so that our systems can understand and exchange information. Okay, so as long as you can kind of keep that, if you can, in your mind, that when I am creating like Rda information, I'm not necessarily creating information that's best for our computer systems. That's going to be important for you, so you have a better understanding of where you need to go to find the information you need. If that makes sense. So and yeah, so like I said, there's all these other ones like presentation standards, value standards. Those, I'm sure if you guys have heard of Library of Congress subject headings, that's kind of considered to be a value standard, a control vocabulary for values, and content standards there in the upper right-hand corner. So like AACR2, which I'll talk about more in just a minute. So Rda, I guess, could also be considered a content standard because it does provide some guidelines. So Anyway, but so hopefully that's helpful in thinking about metadata standards. So speaking of encoding, so here is MARC. So this is all kind of part of what a cataloger does. So the cataloger utilizes standards to create metadata, and then taking that metadata and encoding it for machine readability. Okay, so and this one, I think it just kind of depends on the system. Sometimes a cataloger can actually get away with creating metadata without having to work in the MARC a whole lot. I'm sure some catalogers here in the room probably know what I'm talking about, but at least as of now, most systems will allow you the option of working directly in the MARC, and so it is kind of helpful to know the basics of MARC so you know what you're looking at. So, but yeah, it takes just our metadata and puts it in a machine readable form for our systems to understand. So, but don't worry too much about that at this point. Happy thoughts. I'm providing happy pictures, if you can see this, of a beautiful unicorn and kitties and puppies and my daughter happily playing and so forth. So if this is really overwhelming to you, don't worry. I'm just going to kind of go through the basics of MARC because it is such an important standard in the cataloging world. And then once again, as we kind of move through beyond this webinar, we'll talk more about MARC. So, okay. So how does a cataloger do this? Okay, so I said, that's, what a cataloger does, using standards, encoding that information. How does this happen? So first of all, like I said, most catalogs are created using agreed upon standards. Okay, so first of all, we have to have a basic understanding of what the standards are and how they should be used and why they should be used, so that we know what information to include and how to transcribe it in many cases. So we've already kind of talked a little bit about why it's desirable to have consistent cataloging standards and practices, but just to kind of make it abundantly clear why. So first of all, it's easier to share data within and between libraries. So if we're talking about like copy cataloging, which is where you would have an existing record that's in like Library of Congress's catalog or OCLC WorldCat, and you copy that information into your own system, it's easier when you're using the same standards to do that. Okay, so everybody's doing something completely different, then that gets really messy and confusing. It also it makes less guesswork, right? So if I know that you all, in Florida are using RDA and MARC, then I know that, okay, if in this particular record that I'm looking at, that you have taken, the title from a certain place on this book. Okay, I know that because you're saying that you're using RDA. So it's helpful for me so that I know kind of what to expect from the catalog of records. And same thing with our users, right? So if we're all using different standards, then the users may not know what to expect. They may not know if they're walking into library A, but they're used to using library B, and you're using completely different classification systems, then it'll be confusing. Same thing if they were looking in different online catalogs. If everyone is deciding that they're going to be putting in different information in different ways, then once again, it just takes more time and it's less efficient for our users to find things. But even though on the surface, our catalog records may seem a little different, for the most part, if you look closely, it's all the same information pretty much. It's every single record, because our standards say so. You need to have an author, for example, if there is a stated author. There needs to be publication information, et cetera, et cetera. Okay, so for the most part, when you do go into a catalog, you should be seeing a lot of the same information, and that's by design. Okay, it's not by happenstance. Okay. Also, cataloging standards really help us better wrangle our data, okay, because it's messy, right? For those who are used to working in libraries and working with resources, you know that it's just messy. There's just kind of a lot going on. So, for example, if we want to describe Hamlet by Shakespeare, or just describe William Shakespeare, there are different ways that we can transcribe and represent that person in the catalog. We can just put William Shakespeare. We could put Shakespeare, William. We could put Shakespeare, William and his dates, his birth year and death year. We could add further information that he was, a actor, playwright, etc. But once again, I mean, that's something that we can guess and we can just kind of do on our own. But library standards help us understand kind of what we should include to be consistent, okay, and kind of so that it's easier for people to look under just one form of Shakespeare's name and find it that way, as opposed to trying to type in all these many different ways to find him. Same thing with titles, right? Especially for certain titles that maybe have changed names over time, like Hamlet is a perfect example, or they're maybe published under different titles because of they're like been translated into other languages. It's helpful to kind of, once again, have a standardized way of transcribing a title and knowing, what to use and what part of the resource to use to find like what the main title should be. And then, what other information, right? I mean, obviously, for certain resources, it includes a lot of information, like a lot of like publication history, etc. So do we want to include like the entire publication history in a record, or maybe just some of it? So once again, standards really help us decide what to do with this information. And the main standard we use, at least right now, for that type of information is called RDA, or Resource Description and Access. This helps us identify not only the information we want to include in the catalog record, but also, at least to a certain extent, how to record that information. So once again, when in doubt about what to include, this is where we go. Okay, this is our main source right now for that information in the cataloging world. Okay, so there's different types of description that we focus on in the library world. The one that I was just kind of talking about with RDA is descriptive cataloging. And there's different standards associated with that. So this is where we try as best as we can to capture the information container, if you will, the isness, if you will, of a resource. So that's primarily physical aspects. So like the number of pages, if we're talking about a book, dimensions, do we have, a disc or pages, etc. Names on there. So what is the name of the resource? Does it have a title? Are there any like variations on the title we need to pay attention to? Who's the creator? Okay, author, artist, etc. A lot of this information we can just kind of take directly from the resource itself if it has it. But sometimes we need to do some outside research for that as well. But that's within this realm of descriptive cataloging. On the other hand, there's information that is not always as readily ascertainable, that we have to dig a little bit deeper to find, and that's the information content. And this is part of what's called subject cataloging or analysis. And this is where we try to determine what something is about. So where the information container, descriptive cataloging, is the isness, now we're talking about aboutness primarily, though subject cataloging may also contain information about like genre and form, okay, which is not aboutness, but so like themes, genre, topics, time and place, information that the work is about, okay. And like I said, sometimes it's obvious and sometimes not. Sometimes we have to dig a little deeper. So if we look at like the Hunger Games, for example, if we were just describing this in terms of descriptive cataloging, so container aspects, we can say this as the title, Hunger Games. It's by Suzanne Collins, published by Scholastic Press in 2008. It has 384 pages, ISBN, right? So there's more, right? We can totally say more, but we can typically kind of just look at this and know this is the title, this is the author, etc. And then we also have to look at the subject matter, look at the content, and determine, okay, is this fiction, nonfiction? This is about survival, self-reliance. It's a dystopian, science fiction, young adult book set in this fictional location, Pan Am. etc. So we want to be doing both. So these are both very important, right? So we're doing both descriptive and subject cataloging when we're creating a record, but we're using different standards for that. So, all right, and speaking of which, the subject cataloging standards, I'm just going to talk about briefly because I wanted to really focus more on the descriptive standards for this webinar. But Library of Congress subject headings is probably the most popular subject cataloging standard that you'll see in a library catalog record. It's not the only one. It's not the only subject heading list, but it's a very common one. So typically, right, when you see the subject headings, these terms, these subject terms in a catalog, it's usually Library of Congress subject headings. Okay. And also classification systems. Okay, so Dewey Decimal classification and Library of Congress classification are considered to be subject cataloging standards that do like double duty, right? So they not only put things in either like, topic or discipline order, but also they give it a physical address so that we can organize things on the shelf. Okay, so once again, these are important. They're not ones I'm going to focus on for today, but just so you know, these are the primary, so Library of Congress subject headings, Dewey Decimal and Library of Congress classification are the primary subject standards that catalogers utilize. Okay, there's others, but these are the primary ones. Now, and then there's the encoding standards that are, it's not really part of either descriptive or subject, it's part of both, I guess you could say, because both of the like Library of Congress subject headings and RDA, you'll want to encode using some encoding standards so that it can be, the information is machine readable. So MARC, or Machine-Readable Cataloging, is the primary one that we use in the cataloging world, the library catalog. But you may also see, especially in digital libraries, the uses of extensible markup language, or XML, as well. So there's other ones that we're probably going to be gaining popularity as we kind of move beyond MARC in the future, so like Turtle, etc. I mean, so there's others out there, but these are kind of the primary ones that you'll encounter there. So XML, kind of looking more like HTML, if you're used to HTML. MARC, obviously, its own beast there. Okay, so the three main standards you need to make sure you understand, or at least pay attention to and know that they exist, are MARC, RDA, and ISBD. Okay, so I'm going to go through each of these in turn and explain what they are and why they're important. But in any library catalog record, in most OPACs, these are the main standards that you're going to be seeing if you're looking at like a MARC record. Okay, so you can see here in purple, that's my MARC information. So that, the 24510 $A business, that's our encoding standard. RDA is our content standard you see in green. And then ISBD is our display standard, which is primarily at this point is punctuation. So you can see like the semicolon and the forward slash and the period. That's all what's called ISBD. Okay, so let's start with RDA. I've already talked about RDA a little bit, but let's get into a little bit more detail about resource description and access. So first of all, it's kind of was created by and it's maintained by the RDA Steering Committee, and they have a website which you're welcome to check out. They're an active group for developing RDA, especially now since they're trying to come out with a new RDA that's supposed to be out by the end of the year. We'll see if that actually happens, but it's the first edition of RDA was published in summer of 2010. It's really hard to believe that it's actually been 10 years now since this came out. But it wasn't actually implemented until 2013 by Library of Congress. And since Library of Congress is our main kind of leader in the cataloging world, most libraries just waited to see what Library of Congress did. And so it really wasn't until 2013 and beyond that people really started implementing RDA in their catalogs. RDA, the RDA Steering Committee, likes to refer to these the guidelines or instructions as opposed to rules, okay? And I'll explain more about that in just a minute, but they're just kind of saying, look, this is the stuff that you need to be paying attention to, the elements you need to be paying attention to, and how to transcribe these elements and values in a way. But they're just instructions, they're guidelines, they're not in most cases requirements. So that's why they're kind of shying away from the term rules. But you can find these guidelines or instructions in what's called the Rda Toolkit. It's an online resource. You can technically purchase a print version of RDA, but it's not updated as often as the online Rda Toolkit. But it does require a subscription. It's not freely available, so which is unfortunate in my opinion. But ALA, the American Library Association, is the one that is kind of, owns Rda Toolkit, if you will. And so they pretty much made it clear that they don't have any plans to make this free. So it's you have to subscribe to it to access it. But you can get a 30-day trial. Normally, I think they've extended the trial. Like you can have it, for free for like 60 days, I think now, if you want to try it out. But this is what at least the current homepage looks like for the Rda Toolkit, where we can find all these various instructions. And it has the table of contents down the left-hand side, and you just kind of click on, an instruction, and it kind of brings up in kind of this main window what the element is and what you should do, etc. So, give it a try. It's organized according to Ferber, which I'll talk about in just a minute. But yeah, it's organized according to Ferber. Anyway, set that aside for now. Okay. So RDA helps us answer some questions like these. These are not all the questions that RDA helps us answer, but some of the main ones, like what information should I include in a record for a particular resource? Do I need to include the title, the ISBN, the publisher name, etc.? Which part of the resource should I consult to find certain information? So the title page, cover, like if I'm cataloging a DVD, like, can I just use like the title that's on the container, or do I have to actually pop in the disc and watch the first part of the movie to get the title, right? So, So what's the preferred place to go? And also, who should I identify as the creator of a work, and how should I transcribe that name? So, just as an example, so this is a more interactive part of the webinar. So here I have on the left-hand side a cover of a book, and then on the right-hand side the title page of the same book, and then on the bottom I have a spine of that same book. Okay, so if you had to guess, what do you think the main title is for this book? Okay, so first of all, we want to use the title page. That is, for those of you who are in the know that RDA recommends going to the title page first. So, so Nicole, you're saying like 5 letters is the title. So if we really focus on the title page, yeah, there's kind of a lot going on there. But okay, well, if anyone else is brave enough to to try to, okay, so maybe Hernando Cortez, 5 letters. Yeah. Okay, maybe 5 letters of Cortez, just Hernando Cortez. Wow, we're getting all sorts of different different answers to this, which is fine. It makes sense since this is a very confusing example, but I think it's a good example of how complex some of our resources can be. But yeah, these are all great guesses, and it's one of those things that you do, over time. You build up your judgment, and you have to kind of use other clues to sometimes figure this out. But in this case, the publisher, for whatever reason, decided to put the name of the author, in this case Hernando Cortez, in like really massive font on the title page. So he's actually our author, which will be part of what's called the Statement of Responsibility in the title field. And then the actual title will be 5 letters, 1519 to 1526. So, which you can kind of gather by looking at the cover and the spine title, that, yeah, it's like 5 letters is kind of the main title, or like 5 letters of Cortez. So, yeah, and there's 5 that's like written out, FIVE, and then the use of the number 5, etc. So this one has all sorts of fun things for those of us who are catalogers. Like, oh, there's so much that we can bite into here with this one. But yeah, but once again, this helps us. You knew that, Eva, right? But once again, this having our RDA guidelines at least gives us some idea of, like, first of all, where we should go, right? And then to kind of give us some idea of then what to do with the information that we have. So good. There you go. That was your little brain teaser for this morning. But also, RDA helps us when we are faced with situations where, like, so for example, like a pseudonym. Okay, so does anyone know who Robert Galbraith is? Like, what the real name, so to speak, of Robert Galbraith? This time. Yay! J.K. Rowling, right, of Harry Potter fame. Right, this is her pseudonym that she uses to write these series of mystery books. So, and not everyone knows that, right? And we shouldn't expect them to. So when we're cataloging this book, RDA provides some guidelines on kind of what to do if we do have pseudonyms, right? That we want to present the resource in our catalog records as much as possible how the resource it presents itself, so people can more easily find it. And we don't want to be sending our patrons on a wild goose chase saying, like, well, you can't check out this book or find this book in the catalog unless you know this person's real name, right? So we don't want to do that. So once again, RDA provides some instructions for us on how to handle this. And then on the right, we have our cozy classics. I don't know if you all have encountered these wonderful little board books if in your libraries, but these, I just love these so much. So there's this series of books that they are just board books. There's only like maybe 10 pages or something in these things, and they're based on loosely based on these classics like Jane Austen's Pride and Prejudice, where they have on one page like just a word like happy, and then on the next page it has like these little cute little cloth dolls, acting out a scene from the book. And it's very much not it's not a Pride and Prejudice, right? It's very much simplified for a young audience. But what do we do about that, right? So I mean, can we in the catalog record say this is Jane Austen's Pride and Prejudice? Would that be okay to do, to represent it in that way? What do you all think? Can we just say this is Jane Austen's Pride and Prejudice? That'd probably be a little bit misleading, right? A little bit. But we do want to, say that there is a connection, because there is a connection, right? There's a connection. And once again, RDA is provides a mechanism for us to figure out what we should do, right? So because yeah, we want to make it clear that this is not the same work, but we want to recognize that there is a relationship between them. So once again, that's our RDA helps us do that. Okay, to do that, to decide what to do. So good. Yeah, Kimberly, exactly. She didn't create this, but yeah, but the idea, maybe it's still hers, right? So so the same standard for children's abridged classics. Yeah, Nicole, yeah, exactly. I suppose it kind of depends on how abridged we're talking about, because I know that some are definitely much more abridged than others. Like this one's definitely on the extreme abridgment side of the spectrum, but some other abridgments are not so much. But like, so for example, there's plenty of like audiobooks that are abridged that are not considered to be like completely new works, right? So so once, cataloging, it takes a lot of judgment. I mean, sometimes you have to make a judgment call. And once again, our standards are there to help kind of support us and kind of making an informed decision, but sometimes it's not always clear. So, but I know what you're talking about, especially like the kids' books. Like, I remember like there's plenty of kids' books. Like there's like a Les Miserables, one of this, where it's just like, that's a massive book, the original one, and to having that abridged down to 10 pages, like that's in no way, no way the same work, right? So, yeah, but we do use RDA to essentially say, these are two different works. They're connected, but they're two different works. Oh, really, Nicole? Oh, that's interesting. So reading level depends on the level of abridgment. Yeah. Huh. Interesting. Yeah, makes sense. Anyway, so lots of fun things. And so, just as an FYI, for those who have been in the library world a while, but maybe not in cataloging, you may have heard of AACR2, which is short for Anglo-American Cataloging Rules, 2nd edition. And this was the main descriptive cataloging standard prior to RDA. Okay, so most libraries are using RDA, for the most part nowadays. But prior to that, for like almost 40 years, we were using AACR2, and so there are still plenty of records out there that are AACR2 records, or sorry, created using AACR2 that are still in existence, and that's fine. There was no, special metadata RDA fairy that sprinkled RDA dust on all the AACR2 records to make them, or on the AACR2 records, sorry, to make them RDA. It just didn't happen. But there will be plenty of hybrid, they're called hybrid records, that you'll see that were created under AACR2 that maybe were modified under RDA. So just kind of keep that in mind, that once again, there's going to be a blend of the different standards. So you may be asking, why not AACR3? Okay, so speaking of that, because there was an AACR1, there's AACR2, why not AACR3? So RDA, the developers RDA, they wanted to change the name so that the code and name would be more kind of internationally inclusive sounding. So resource and description and access is a bit more neutral. And then they wanted a content standard that's designed for the digital world, so that it better accommodates not only digital resources, but allows catalogers to create metadata that's more of the web. Okay, so more machine actionable, that better fits within a linked data environment. If that doesn't make sense to you, don't worry. Especially, in other words, the developers of RDA wanted a standard that kind of better fit in our day and age, with so many resources being digital and us having online catalogs. They wanted us to be producing metadata that's less kind of card catalog like and more web like, if you will. And they also wanted a different approach to describing and relating information entities through this conceptual model called FRBR, or the Functional Requirements for Bibliographic Records. FRBR is very important for RDA. That's why I'm going to devote an entire webinar to that next time. That'll be next month. I'll give that. But RDA is organized according to FRBR. It uses all these FRBR terminologies. Cindy, thank you. So to say it's next month. That's in May, and yeah, May 8th. Okay, so it's important to understand RDA. It's important to understand FRBR. So I'll go into the basics of that. All right. So moving beyond RDA for just a moment, the other standard I wanted to talk about is ISBD, which is short for the International standard bibliographic description. The primary one that we see used in records is the general one, so the ISBD G, but we just say ISBD generally. So this was actually published in 1977 initially, and it became part of AACR2 because AACR2 was published around that same time period. But what it does is it identified specific elements, the order of the elements, and punctuation patterns that distinguish the elements. And this was really important at the time just because there was this great uptick in the number of, in the amount of sharing that we were doing of catalog information around the world, so internationally. So it made it much easier to share records because they're much more consistent using these specific elements, their order, and their punctuation. So just as an example, here, well, actually, before I show you the example, here are the ISBD elements and the order of the elements. So according to ISBD, you need to have these elements and information at minimum if they're available. So like title, statement of responsibility information. If a book is in a certain edition, include that, etc. Okay, so at minimum, we should have this information in the record if available, in this order, preferably. And I think that's really important to remember at the time. Remember, this is still during card catalog days, okay? So having the information, certain information in a certain order was really important for us to share cards that maybe were not in a language we understood, right? So here, throwback Friday to a card from a card catalog where you can see this information about, the author, title, publication, but if you can see the various punctuation marks, right? So this forward slashes, the semicolons, the colons, that's all ISBD. And that is important because instead of putting like a label, like title is this, author is this, instead of that, ISBD allowed us to use a shorthand, punctuation marks to represent those element names, those labels. Okay, so it makes it much easier to put a lot more information on cards because we only had so much space, only so much space. Okay, so the reason why I'm bringing this up to you now is because we still use these punctuation marks. We may not always use ISBD order. We still use the elements, maybe not the order, but we still use these punctuation marks in MARC cataloging. It's still, MARC kind of requires us to do that. So can someone tell me the difference between these two entries here? Like it's just one long, what's called title and statement of responsibility. What's the difference between these two? There's only one thing. Right, very good. Just making sure everybody's paying attention. So good, right. One has a colon and one has a semicolon, right? So that's the only difference here. But they make a huge difference in terms of what the information means, okay? So, and that's not always the case in every part of an RDA record, but it's still important. So Terry, that's a good question. Why? Why is this? So, so the first one, just so you understand what's going on here. So the colon in this particular field precedes, is essentially a subtitle. Okay, so in this scenario, Into the Darkness is the main title of the work. It has a subtitle, Bob's Journey Through the Enchanted Forest, and then an author, Hetty Pinecone. In the second example with the semicolon, what this is saying is that there's two main titles, Into the Darkness and Bob's Journey Through the Enchanted Forest. That's if you have like a book that has two plays in it, right? Or two short stories, right, that have different titles. That's kind of what's going on here. So it's not a main title subtitle relationship. It's two different main titles. And it's just because of this simple punctuation mark. And once again, this made a lot more difference when we were working with cards, right? Because we weren't using MARC in our cards. So we needed this to make that the punctuation marks to distinguish this information. Because MARC kind of grew up alongside ISBD, we are using them in tandem. We're still using them. So this then brings me to MARC. Okay, so moving on to our last major standard. So bear with me here. So if you like the Ryan Gosling, like, what's going on? You keep mentioning this MARC guy. I'm getting jealous. What's going on here? So I love this, the librarian Hey Girl. If you're if you're into these memes, I don't think it's been updated in a while, but it's funny anyway. But okay, so machine readable cataloging. If you kind of look closely at this record, if you don't understand all of it, that's fine. So you can see here, if you kind of set aside all the little numbers and lowercase letters and so forth, you can still see these punctuation marks, the colons, the commas, the forward slash, the semicolons. It's still present in MARC. We still use it in MARC because it sometimes determines the meaning of a particular subfield, like in the case of that subtitle that I just showed you. So, which is unfortunate, but that's kind of how it is. So, because in MARC, in that title field, the subtitle or the other title information, etc., is that subfield B, and that meaning changes depending on the punctuation mark. So, so much fun. Okay, but MARC, it's been around for a while. Okay, so it was developed in the 1960s by the Library of Congress, specifically Henriette Avram, a computer scientist who worked for the Library of Congress. And even though it has changed over time, it's not the exact same as it was in the 60s, it's still basically the same. So we're using a standard that's over 50 years old. Only in the library world do we use this. And it was originally used as a way for Library of Congress to disseminate and print cards more easily and quickly. The current version that we use is MARC 21, 21 standing for the 21st century. But there used to be multiple MARCs out there, and this is a merger of the United States MARC and the Canadian MARC, or CanMARC, in 2000. All MARC fields are 3 digits long, period. Okay, there's none that are less than 3 digits and none that are longer than 3 digits. Okay, so it's like 020, 100, 245, 650. Okay. Next to the MARC field code are what are called indicators, 2 spaces that sometimes contain numbers that mean different things depending on the field. Okay, so we'll see this once we do get into the actual cataloging later on in the workshop, that they're important to include because they mean different things. And then the MARC subfields are included within the MARC fields. They're preceded by what's called a delimiter symbol, which I'm just going to use the $sign to represent that. But you may see in other systems that it's like a pipe character or a double dagger, etc. It looks different depending on the system. But after the $sign will be a lowercase letter or a number. Okay. Now, if we look at, this is Oclc Connection. So this is like the cataloger view of WorldCat. Here is just kind of a typical MARC record for a wonderful, wonderful book. That's just fabulous and a great beach read if you're interested. But anyway, here we have and see here in red, I've kind of highlighted the MARC field codes, okay, that kind of determine the field. Okay, there's like the 245 is title and statement of responsibility information. 300 is physical description, is shorthand essentially for the meaning of the information in the field. Then we have the indicators here in purple, 2 slots. Sometimes they're filled, sometimes they're not, but they mean different things depending on the field. Okay. And then finally we have our little, I'm bouncing, bounce, 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 bounce to my little subfield codes, which that also kind of tells you the various information in here. So like we would have in one MARC field, multiple information, multiple elements, so to speak, there, like in the case of this 245 field, we have both the title as well as the statement of responsibility, which is in my case, okay. So we use the subfields to delineate between the different elements. And here are just, because I'm running out of time here, I want just very quickly, there's a kind of a method to the madness here in terms of the order. of the MARC fields and kind of the, they're kind of clustered together for different types of information, but you can kind of look at that on your own. And here, once again, to kind of bring it all together, taking all three of these standards, we kind of use them all within one, and we would take something like this title page, and we can say this is an RDA, the title proper, customers for life, other title information, so subtitle, how to turn that one-time buyer into a lifetime customer, and then statement of responsibility by Carl Sewell and Paul B. Brown. So we can do that with these labels using RDA. Then we can take that same information without having to use these labels, using ISBD punctuation marks instead, right? So that colon, as I told you, represents subtitle, and subtitle information comes after it, yeah? And then finally taking that same information and encoding it in MARC so that our systems can understand what to do with that information, okay? Now, that was our first journey through the introduction to library catalog standards. We don't really have, I'm happy to stay to answer any questions if you're able to stay beyond our allotted time here. But what, if you, yeah, but any questions, comments? Oh, you actually have that button, Kathy? Oh, lucky. I love that button. I want that button. So what do you all think? Was this helpful in you kind of having a better understanding of what standards are used in a catalog record? Okay.
Dr. Snow, I know that was helpful for me. I had forgotten about the difference between MARC and RDA and ISBD. It'd been a long time since I'd had cataloging.
Yeah, for like a lot of people, it's good to have the refresher, even if you do even work with this stuff every day. It's helpful to have the refresher. But I think I saw that someone mentioned, like, are we going to go into more details on indicators? So this is a good prompt to say, first of all, there will be another webinar, as we talked about, on Ferber next month. But I want to go into much more detail about what each fields mean, what the indicators mean, etc. Ideally during this workshop, but that's something we still need to talk about if this workshop is going to happen in person. Because if it can't happen in person, then I can kind of break it up into a series of webinars as well. So where we do go into that detail. So yeah.
Yeah, that sounds really good. Amy asks, will we have access to the slides?
Absolutely. Yeah. So I did send the slides to SWFLN, and I'm happy to have them send them out to you all. So yeah, that's totally fine.
And there will be a copy of this available by Wednesday, and I will send out an exit email to all of you with that recording, a link to that recording, and a copy of the slides. And I'd like to thank you a lot for that really great webinar, Dr. Snow. It was a great refresher. And as you can see on the slide, if you enjoyed this webinar, please register for Beginner's Guide to Functional Requirements for Bibliographic Records, or Ferber, on May 8th at 10 a.m. Eastern. And thank you to our American Sign Language interpreter, Deb McLean. And to all of you out there, we appreciate you spending time with us. Please be safe and have a very good rest of your day. And I'm going to mute my microphone, but I'll be watching the chat to see if any more questions come up.